The auctioneer dropped the hammer. But Ryder stopped the sale. The hammer fell like thunder on Margaret Whitmore's heart. Sold to Henderson for $800. The auctioneer's voice cut to the morning air, sharp as winter wind through canyon walls. Margaret stood frozen at the edge of the crowd, watching strangers bid on her father's blood and sweat like it was nothing more than timber and nails. The Whitmore ranch stretched behind the auction block. 40 years of backbreaking work under the merciless Arizona sun. Every fence post her father had driven. Every well he dug with his own bleeding hands. Every calf born in those pastures carried his brand, his hope, his stubborn refusal to quit when the droughts came and the cattle died and the banknotes came due. Now it belonged to a man who'd never felt desert dust coat his throat or watched buzzards circle a dying herd. Next lot. The auctioneer called, mopping sweat from his brow. The furniture and household goods of the deceased. Margaret's stomach turned. Deceased. Like her father was just paperwork now, his name reduced to legal language and lot numbers. Thomas Whitmore had been more than that. He'd been the man who taught her to read the sky for weather, to judge a horse by the set of its ears, to shoot straight and never waste ammunition. He'd been the one who held her mother's hand when the fever took her, and who never remarried because some loves don't come twice. The crowd pressed closer as the auctioneer's helpers carried out her mother's rocking chair. Margaret bit her lip until she tasted copper. That chair had held 3 generations of Whitmore women, creaking gently through long evenings while children played at their feet and the desert wind sang lullabies through the eaves. The morning dragged on like a funeral march. Piece by piece, her life disappeared into strangers' hands. The dining table where she'd learned to write her letters. The iron skillet that had fed cowboys through roundup season. Her mother's china tea set, save for special occasions that came too rarely and ended too soon. With each falling hammer, Margaret felt another piece of herself chipped away. The crowd's faces blurred together. Town merchants and traveling traders, neighboring ranchers who'd known her father for decades but wouldn't meet her eyes now. Shame burned in her chest, hot as forge fire. They all knew why she was here, why everything had to go. The gambling debts, the whiskey bills, the long nights when grief drove her father to seek solace in cards and bottles that promised to wash away the pain, but only deepen the hole in his heart. Final lot of the day, the auctioneer announced, his voice hoarse from calling bids. The livestock, 20 head of mixed cattle for horses and sundry farm equipment. Margaret's throat closed. The horses, her father's pride, bloodlines he'd spent years perfecting. They weren't just animals. They were family, companions who'd shared the long loneliness of ranch life. The bidding started low. Too low. These men knew desperation when they smelled it, knew she had no choice but to take whatever they offered. The hammer rose. Margaret held her breath, waiting for the final blow to fall. That's when she heard it. Hoofbeats on hard ground, coming fast from the direction of the main road. The crowd turned as one, shading their eyes against the morning sun. A rider approached through the heat shimmer, his horse lathered with sweat and blowing hard. The auctioneer hesitated, hammer suspended in midair. The crowd murmured and shifted, sensing something in the air like the electric charge before a thunderstorm. The rider pulled up at the edge of the gathering, dust swirling around his mount's legs. Margaret caught a glimpse of weathered leather chaps and a hat pulled low over hard eyes. He sat his saddle like a man born to it, still as carved stone except for the steady rise and fall of his chest. "Hold that hammer," he said, his voice carrying clear across the crowd. "This sale ain't over yet." The stranger's horse stamped and snorted, foam flecking its muzzle. Whoever this man was. He'd ridden hard to get here, pushing his mount to the edge of endurance. The crowd parted as he dismounted, boots hitting the ground with the solid thump of a man who'd spent more years in the saddle than most spent breathing. Margaret studied his face as he approached the auction block. Weathered skin spoke of decades under the desert sun, and lines around his eyes told of squinting into dust storms and bright horizons. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, the kind of careful maintenance that marked a man who owned little but cared for what he had. A Colt revolver rode low on his hip, the grip worn smooth by countless draws. "Now see here." The auctioneer sputtered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the morning chill. "This is a legal proceeding. You can't just—" "Can't what?" The stranger's voice carried the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket, the movement deliberate and unhurried. "Can't present evidence that might change things considerable?" Murmurs rippled to the crowd like wind through wheat. Margaret felt her heart hammer against her ribs. Evidence? What evidence could possibly stop this nightmare from playing out to its bitter end? The stranger held up the paper, making sure everyone could see it. "Name's Cole Brennan. I rode with Thomas Whitmore during the Apache troubles, back when this whole territory was nothing but scorpions and prayer. Tom saved my life more than once, and I owed him a debt." He paused, let his words settle over the gathering like dust after a cattle drive. Margaret's breath caught. She'd heard that name before, whispered around the supper table, when her father thought she wasn't listening. Cole Brennan, the scout who'd guided wagon trains through hostile country, the man who could track anything that walked or crawled across God's creation. 3 months ago, Brennan continued, Tom sent me a letter, said he was in trouble, bad trouble, and asked for help. By the time I got here, he was already in the ground. His eyes found Marg in the crowd, and she saw something there that made her chest tighten, recognition and maybe pity. But before he died, he told someone the truth about his debts. Someone who matters. The auctioneer's face had gone pale as whitewash. "Mr. Brennan, I assure you this sale is completely legitimate. The deceased owed substantial sums to Ezra Morrison." Brennan's voice cut through the protest like a blade through silk. "Gambling debts, mostly. Except Tom Whitmore. Never gambled a day in his life after his wife died. Wouldn't touch cards or dice, so they were the devil's own tools." A collective intake of breath swept the crowd. Margaret's knees nearly buckled. Her father, a non-gambler? But she'd seen the bills, the demands for payment. You're saying someone forged those debts?" Henderson, the man who'd bought the ranch, stepped forward, his chest puffed out like a bantam rooster. "That's a serious accusation, mister." Brennan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Serious accusations require serious proof, which I happen to have." He unfolded the paper with careful precision. "This here's a sworn statement from Doc Morrison, Ezra's own brother. Seems a good doctor got tired of watching his kin destroy innocent folks." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the desert wind whispering secrets through the mesquite. Doc Morrison, the town physician who delivered half the babies in the county and buried their grandparents. If he'd turned against his own brother, according to this, Brennan went on, his voice carrying easily across the stunned crowd, Ezra Morrison's been running a loan shark operation for years, targeting widowers and desperate men, forging gambling debts, then foreclosing on her property when they couldn't pay. Tom Whitmore was just the latest victim. Henderson's face had turned the color of wet clay. "Even if that's true, I bought this ranch in good faith. I paid fair money. To a crook." Brennan folded the paper and tucked it back into his vest, which makes the sale invalid. Fruit of a poisoned tree, as the lawyers say. Margaret felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Invalid? Could it really be that simple? Could her father's reputation be restored with a single piece of paper? The shame that had been eating at her for months suddenly felt less heavy, less permanent. The crowd was growing restless. Men who come expecting easy pickings were now facing the possibility of losing their bargains. Voices rose in angry murmurs, and Margaret caught fragments of heated conversation. The auctioneer mopped his brow again, his hands shaking slightly. "Mr. Brennan, even if what you say is true, there are legal procedures. This matter will have to go before a judge. Will it?" Brennan's hand drifted toward his gun, not threatening, just resting there like a man checking his pocket watch. "Seems to me the only legal procedure needed is stopping a criminal enterprise. Unless you're part of it, too." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire. Margaret watched the auctioneer's Adam's apple bob as he swallowed hard. Around them, the crowd shifted uneasily. Some men were already backing toward their horses and wagons, sensing trouble brewing like a thunderstorm on the horizon. Henderson stepped closer to the auction block, his jaw set stubborn as bedrock. "I don't know you from Adam, mister, but I know I paid good money for this property. You can't just ride in here with some paper. And what?" Brennan's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow everyone heard it. "Stop you from profiting off a dead man's misery? Stop you from stealing a daughter's inheritance." The challenge was clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Margaret held her breath, watching two very different kinds of men size each other up under the desert sun. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, lonesome and wild. Before either man could speak, another voice cut to the morning air like a buzzsaw through pine. Well, Cole Brennan." The crowd turned toward the voice. A man in a black suit emerged from behind the auctioneer's wagon, his boots polished to a mirror shine, despite the dust. Ezra Morrison moved with the calculated grace of a snake sunning itself on a rock, unhurried, confident, dangerous. His smile was all teeth and no warmth. "Been a long time, Cole. Heard you were up north, guiding settlers through the passes." Brennan's eyes never left Morrison's face. "Been keeping busy. Unlike some folks who prefer easier prey." Morrison's laugh was dry as autumn leaves. "Now that's hardly fair. I'm just a businessman, same as any other. Man's got to make a living in this hard country. By forging debt papers?" Brennan's voice stayed level, but Margaret caught the edge underneath, sharp as a skinning knife. "By targeting grieving widowers when they're too broken to think straight? Careful with those accusations, old friend." Morrison's hand brushed against his coat, and Margaret glimpsed the silver handle of a derringer tucked inside. "Might be you've been listening to the wrong people. My brother Doc's been having difficulties lately. Drinking too much, talking nonsense." The lie hung between them like morning mist, there for everyone to see but too dangerous to touch. Margaret felt her stomach clench as she watched Morrison work the crowd with his eyes, reminding them silently of his influence in town. The bank loans he controlled, the businesses he could make or break with a word. "Funny thing about grief," Brennan said, pulling out a tobacco pouch and beginning to roll a cigarette with steady fingers. "Makes a man do things he'd never consider when his mind was clear. Tom Whitmore loved his wife something fierce. When she died, it near killed him too." Margaret's throat tightened. She remembered those dark months after her mother's passing, how her father had walked around the ranch like a ghost haunting his own life. "That's when Morrison here started coming around," Brennan continued, striking a match against his thumbnail, "bringing whiskey, offering friendly card games to help a grieving man forget his troubles. Except those friendly games had a way of costing more than anyone expected. You got proof of that, Drifter?" Henderson had found his voice again, though it shook slightly. Brennan lit his cigarette and took a slow drag, letting the smoke curl between his lips. "Got more than proof. Got witnesses. Seems Tom wasn't the only man Morrison targeted. Jake Sullivan lost his spread last year the same way. Pete Kowalski's fighting to keep his mind. All of them telling the same story. Friendly visits that turned into financial ruin." Morrison's smile faltered for just an instant, so quick Margaret almost missed it. But Brennan caught it, and his own expression hardened like iron cooling in winter air. "Interesting story," Brennan said, flicking ash from his cigarette. "Except for one small problem. Tom kept a journal. Wrote in it every night for 20 years, documenting every head of cattle, every dollar spent, every hand played." He paused, letting that sink in. "Including detailed accounts of your visits, Ezra, dates, times, amounts. All of it." Morrison's face went pale as milk. A journal could be forged same as anything else. Not this one. Tom had a particular way of writing, specific phrases he used. Anyone who knew him would recognize it. Brennan's smile was sharp as a wolf's grin. Plus, he had it witnessed and notarized by Judge Parker every month. Legal precaution, you might say. The silence that followed was profound as a church during prayer. Margaret felt hope rising in her chest like water in a well after rain. A journal. Legal proof that could clear her father's name and expose Morrison's crimes. Morrison's hand moved toward his hidden derringer, the motion barely perceptible in the morning shadows. Margaret opened her mouth to shout a warning, but Brennan was already moving, his own gun clearing leather with the fluid grace of long practice. I wouldn't. Brennan's voice was quiet as death. Not unless you want to find out how fast I really am. The tableau held for 3 heartbeats. Morrison's hand frozen halfway to his weapon. Brennan's Colt steady as bedrock. The crowd holding its collective breath like the desert itself was waiting to see how this would end. Then Morrison slowly raised his hands, palms open, but his eyes burned with promises of future reckoning. The standoff stretched taut as rawhide in the rain. Morrison's hands trembled slightly in the air, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning breeze. Brennan's gun never wavered, the barrel pointing steady as a compass needle at Morrison's chest. "Smart choice," Brennan said quietly. "Now let's talk about making this right." But Henderson wasn't finished. The merchant stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation and something that might have been fear. "Now hold on just a minute. Even if Morrison's guilty of what you claim, I bought that ranch fair and square. I got papers, legal documents, built on fraud." Brennan's free hand reached into his saddlebags, pulling out a leather portfolio thick with documents. "Judge Parker's already reviewed the evidence. Sale's been declared null and void as of this morning." Margaret's heart leaped, but Henderson's expression turned ugly. "You think you can just ride in here and steal what's mine? I got friends in this town, connections. You're nothing but a drifter with a gun and some tall tales." "Maybe so." Brennan holstered his Colt with deliberate slowness, the movement calculated to show confidence rather than surrender. "But those tall tales come with sworn affidavits, witness statements, and a federal marshal's backing." The crowd stirred uneasily at the mention of federal authority. Local politics were one thing, but when the government got involved, smart men found reasons to be elsewhere. Morrison lowered his hands gradually, his politician smile returned like a mask sliding back into place. "This is all very dramatic, Cole, but you're making a mistake. These good people came here expecting to conduct legitimate business. You can't just wave some papers around and expect." "Can I?" Brennan's voice cut through Morrison's smooth words like an axe through kindling. "Seems to me the only mistake was trusting a snake in a suit." Margaret stepped forward, her voice finding strength she didn't know she possessed. "That's right. Every penny will be returned. My father was an honest man, and his debts will be settled honestly." "Your father was a drunk and a gambler," Henderson snarled, his composure finally cracking. "Everyone knows it. Just because this gunslinger shows up with some forged papers doesn't change what Tom Whitmore was." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow, but before she could respond, Brennan stepped between them. His movement was casual, almost lazy, but there was something in his bearing that made Henderson take an involuntary step backward. "Mister, you just called a good man's daughter a liar." Brennan's voice was conversational, but it carried the chill of winter wind through canyon walls. "Where I come from, that's poor manners." Henderson's face went from red to pale in the space of a heartbeat. Around them, the crowd was beginning to thin as men decided they had pressing business elsewhere. Nobody wanted to be standing too close when the shooting started. "Tell you what," Brennan said, his tone deceptively mild. "Since there seems to be some disagreement about the facts, why don't we let a jury decide? Federal court convenes next month. Morrison can present his version of events, and I'll present mine." Morrison's mask slipped again, just for an instant. A federal trial meant scrutiny he couldn't control, witnesses he couldn't intimidate, judges he couldn't buy. His whole operation would come under the harsh light of legal examination. "That won't be necessary," he said quickly. "I'm sure we can reach some accommodation." "No." Margaret's voice rang out clear as a bell across the desert morning. "I won't pay 1 penny of fraudulent debts. My father's name will be cleared, and his property will stay in the family where it belongs." Henderson stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You think you can just take back what I paid for? You got swindled." Brennan's hand drifted back toward his gun, not threatening, just reminding everyone present of the stakes. Same as Tom Whitmore. Same as half a dozen other good men. Difference is, you got a chance to walk away with your skin intact. The merchant's eyes darted between Brennan's gun and Morrison's pale face, calculating odds that kept getting worse. "This isn't over," Henderson said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage. "You do that." Brennan nodded agreeably. "But until then, you'll be staying off Whitmore property. Wouldn't want there to be any misunderstandings about trespassing." Morrison straightened his coat and adjusted his tie, trying to salvage some dignity from the wreckage of his schemes. "Cole, you always did have a taste for lost causes. But this isn't the frontier anymore. Law and order matter. Contracts matter. You can't just settle disputes with a gun." Brennan smiled, but it was cold as January moonlight. "You're right about one thing. Ezra, this isn't the old frontier. Which means when I drag you into federal court, you won't have your local cronies to protect you. Just you, me, and the evidence." The promise hung in the air between them like the scent of gunpowder after lightning. Morrison turned and walked toward his buggy, his steps carefully measured to show he wasn't retreating, just choosing to leave. But everyone watching knew the difference. As his buggy rolled away, dust rising in its wake, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Not quite victory, not yet, but the possibility of it. The auctioneer was already packing his gavel, muttering about complications and legal troubles. Most of the crowd had scattered like quail after a hawk's shadow. The dust settled slowly, like grief learning to rest. Margaret stood in the sudden quiet of her own land, watching the last of the vultures drive away in their wagons and buggies. The auction block sat empty now, its wooden platform stained with sweat and broken dreams that weren't hers after all. Brennan was checking his horse's hooves, giving her space to breathe without the weight of curious eyes. Margaret studied a man who'd ridden in like something out of a dime novel, all dusty leather and quiet authority. "Why?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. He looked up from the horse's leg, squinting against the climbing sun. "Why what? Why help us? You said you owed my father a debt, but men die with debts unpaid every day. Why ride 300 miles to honor one?" Brennan straightened, wiping his hands on a faded bandana. For a moment he just stood there, looking out across the scrubland toward the mountains that rose like broken teeth against the sky. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old sorrows. "Your father pulled me out of an Apache ambush up near Tucson, back in '78. Took a bullet in the shoulder doing it, bled all over his saddle for 2 days while we rode to safety." He paused, rolling his shoulders as if feeling phantom pain. "Could have left me there. Would have been smarter, tactically speaking. One man's easier to hide than two." Margaret waited, sensing there was more. But that wasn't Tom Whitmore's way. He said a man's got to stand for something bigger than his own skin, or what's the point of breathing? Brennan's weathered hands worked the bandana, folding and refolding it with unconscious precision. "I've been carrying that lesson for 15 years. Figure it was time to put it to use." The wind picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. Margaret closed her eyes and let it wash over her, cleansing away the morning's poison. "Morrison won't give up easy," Brennan said. "Men like him don't take kindly to public embarrassment. He'll try other ways to get what he wants." "What kinds of ways?" "Hard to say. Could be legal harassment, trumped-up charges, convenient accidents." Brennan's tone was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather. "He's got connections, money, influence, all the things that matter in civilized places." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. "So we won a battle, not the war. Maybe. Or maybe we hurt him bad enough that he'll find easier prey." Brennan studied her face, measuring something she couldn't name. "Question is, what do you plan to do now? Running a ranch alone ain't easy work, especially for a woman. Folks will be watching, waiting to see if you can make it stick." The challenge's words stung, but Margaret recognized the truth underneath. She'd never worked cattle alone, never managed the books or negotiated sales, or dealt with 100 daily crises that kept a ranch running. "I'll learn," she said, lifting her chin. This land's been in my family for 2 generations. I won't be the one to lose it. Brennan nodded slowly. Takes more than stubbornness to run cattle. Need hands you can trust, buyers who'll deal fair, neighbors who'll help when times get lean. Your father had 20 years to build those relationships. You're starting from scratch. The weight of it pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Margaret looked out across the pastures where her father's cattle grazed. Those same animals she'd just watched strangers bit on like sides of beef. There might be another way, Brennan said quietly. Margaret turned to face him, hope and wariness warring in her chest. What kind of way? Ranch needs a foreman. Someone who knows cattle, knows the country, knows which end of the gun to point at trouble. He met her eyes directly, his expression unreadable. I've been drifting for 15 years, never staying anywhere long enough to call a home. Maybe it's time to try putting down roots. The offer hung between them like morning mist, there and not there at the same time. Margaret studied his face, looking for the catch, the angle, the hidden price that always came a help in this hard country. But all she saw was a tired man who'd spent too many years sleeping under other people's stars. You do that? Stay on as foreman? For a fair wage and a decent bunk. Yes. And one other thing. Brennan's voice carried a note she couldn't quite identify. Your father's journal, the one with all the evidence against Morrison. I want it kept safe, somewhere he can't get to it. Man like that's got long reach and longer memory. Margaret nodded, understanding the wisdom in it. The journal was her father's final gift, his vindication written in his own careful hand. But it was also a weapon that could destroy Morrison completely, which made it dangerous to possess. There's a safe in town at the bank, she said. Judge Parker's got the only other key. Good. We'll ride in tomorrow, get locked up proper. Brennan gathered his horse's reins, preparing to mount. For now, I'll bed down in the bunkhouse, if that's agreeable. We can talk terms over supper. He swung into the saddle with the easy grace of a man born to it, settling into the worn leather like he was coming home. Margaret watched him ride toward the ranch buildings, dust rising from his horse's hooves in small puffs that the wind scattered almost before they formed. The auction block still stood empty in the yard, a wooden monument to the morning's victory. Tomorrow she'd tear it down, burn for kindling, or chop it up for fence posts. Something useful, something that served the land instead of feeding on it. But tonight, for the first time in months, she'd sleep in her own bed on her own land, with the sound of her own cattle lowing in the distance and the promise of sunrise on familiar ground. Some victories came with a price, but some prices were worth paying.